Hello, Professor Yepes. This video is to provide an update on my work so far. In summary, this paper examines the monetary policy effects on key macroeconomic variables for sub-Saharan Africa, and I also carry out a subsample analysis where I look at how the effects are changed in the few periods leading into the pandemic. And another key thing I've added in the study is to examine how the extreme COVID pandemic shocks affected the model estimates. And the reason for this is because according to studies such as Lenza and Primiseri 2020, Caribou and others 2021, and Bobeika and Hartwig 2022, extreme shocks experienced during the pandemic strongly affects estimates and forecasts of standard VAS. So I estimate the model without these shocks and then compare the results to the estimates I had with the shocks. So another key thing was to plot the graphs in growth rates rather than levels. And another important or key thing I've done is to plot the graphs for the sub-Saharan African region, in addition to looking at the 6 countries I was analyzing. So over here we have the GDP growth rate for sub-Saharan Africa, and as we can see, the growth rate has been following a downward trend in recent years, with a sharp decline in 2020 where the growth rate was negative. When we look at the GDP growth rate of 6 countries mostly affected by the pandemic in terms of the number of cases recorded in these countries, again we see a sharp decline in the GDP growth rates for each of these countries as observed in the graph. So for instance, with South Africa, we see a decline from 1% in 2019 to as low as -7% in 2020. In order to alleviate the economic downturn experienced during the COVID, most central banks imposed various expansionary monetary policy measures to boost the economy. And over here we have the money supply growth rates for the whole sub-Saharan African region. And as we can see in the graph, there was a high increase in the growth rate of money supply within the region during 2020. So when we look at the interest rates for each of these countries, we see a decline in interest rates during the pandemic, with majority of them recording their lowest interest rates in 2020. According to Adam and others, 2022, almost half of African countries reached their historical lows during the pandemic. And another study by Ekeruche 2021 also found that 85% of central banks in Africa reduced their interest rates, 38% cut their reserve requirement ratio, while 26% provided direct liquidity support to businesses. Also, when we look at inflation, there was an increase in inflation during the pandemic within the region, although this wasn't the highest to have been recorded since 1990. Fiscal policy stimuli were other measures employed during the pandemic, and as we can see from the graph, there is a sharp increase in the growth rate of government spending as a percentage of GDP in 2020, although we see it decline in the subsequent year. The model used for the study is a p-VAR as specified in equation 1, with 7 variables included in the model. The identification strategy used is the Cholesky decomposition, with the variables ordered as commodity price, government spending, output, followed by inflation, interest rates, money supply, and finally exchange rates. And the model is estimated using a GMM approach by Abrigo and Love 2016. Under this approach, the panel-specific fixed effects are corrected for by first differencing the model, and the lags of the variables are used as instruments when estimating the model to account for endogeneity. Also, I use data for 43 sub-Saharan African countries from the period 1990 to 2021. This here provides the summary stats for the data used for the full sample analysis as well as the subsample analysis. And the optimal lag length selected for the study was 2. I also carry out a unit root test to ensure that the instruments used are not weak due to the presence of unit roots. And as we can see from the table, GDP, commodity price, and government spending are not stationary. So I took the first difference of these variables, conducted the test again, and as we can see, they are now stationary. So I estimate the p-val model using 4 instruments and 2 lags. Over here, I have a test for the stability of the model, and as we can see, all the eigen values lie within the unit circle, and as there are no imaginary roots. I also conducted Granger causality tests, and for GDP, we see causality running from exchange rates, interest rates, and government spending to GDP. The other variable of interest is exchange rates, and we found no causality from any of the variables to exchange rates. And for inflation, there is causality from all the variables except money supply and government spending. I'll quickly talk about the IRFs obtained from the model. So over here I have the effect of a positive shock to interest rates, and as you can see, this has a pro-cyclical effect on the economy with a decline in output, a decline in inflation, and an exchange rate appreciation. Also, a positive shock to money supply led to an increase in output and inflation and a decline in exchange rates, although all these are not significant at 5%. For a positive shock to government spending, we see an increase in output, an increase in inflation, and an exchange rate depreciation. Although this depreciation is not significant. And then finally, I also look at the effect of a commodity price shock. A positive shock to commodity price leads to an increase in output, an increase in inflation on impact, which declines in subsequent years. And then we also see a decline. We also see an increase in the exchange rate, which implies a depreciation. I look at the variance decomposition, the variance decomposition for output, exchange rate, and inflation, which are the variables of interest. And for each of these variables, the variation in these variables can be explained by themselves. Next, I look at the subsample analysis with data from the period 2010 to 2021. Again, I consider the stability of the model, and as you can see, the model is stable with no imaginary roots. And I'll quickly talk about the IRFs as well. So over here we see that for the subsample analysis, there is a stronger response of output to a money supply shock compared to the full sample period. Also, over here, positive government spending shock has a higher positive and more persistent impact on output compared to the full sample period. Commodity price shock also has a higher immediate positive impact on inflation compared to the full sample period. And another thing was that government spending shock caused a currency appreciation rather than a depreciation. So in summary, the impact of the shock is stronger with the subsample analysis. So I also estimate the model, but this time without the pandemic observations, just to see how this affects the estimates. And as we can see from the graph, the results are very similar to what was obtained when these pandemic observations were included in estimating the model. The main differences or the minor differences observed were that, first of all, the effect of an interest rate shock on output is lower when the pandemic observations were excluded. Also, the response of inflation to an interest rate shock is slightly lower in this case. And another difference observed was the impact of inflation on inflation due to a government spending shock. So over here, this effect was delayed compared to when the pandemic observations were included. So, conclusion, this study first examined the monetary policy effects for sub-Saharan Africa with data on 43 countries from the period 1990 to 2021. And this was done using a panel VAR model and a GMM estimation technique. The study also carries out a subsample analysis with data from 2010 to 2021 to see if the results are altered in the few periods leading to the pandemic. The study also conducts the analysis with the exclusion of the pandemic observations to determine if the inclusion of these shocks to macroeconomic variables affect the estimates and predictions of the model. So for the full sample, the results show that there is a pro-cyclical effect on the economy following an interest rate shock in terms of an increase in outputs, exchange rate appreciation, a decrease in outputs, exchange rate appreciation, and an increase and a decrease in inflation. Also, the effect of a money supply shock on these variables were not significant. In the subsample analysis, both interest rates and money supply shocks, as well as government spending shocks, have a significant pro-cyclical effect on output and inflation. Also, the effect of a government spending shock on output growth is significantly positive and robust to the time period under study, as well as the inclusion or exclusion of pandemic shocks in estimating the model. Also, the empirical evidence in this study suggests that both fiscal and monetary policy have significant impact on output growth for sub-Saharan Africa, and as such, the use of these policies during periods of economic turmoil, such as the pandemic period, helps to stabilize the economy. So, one limitation of this study is that the findings in relation to the pandemic employs data from the period 2010 to 2021. However, the pandemic period is mainly from 2020 to 2021. Hence, the results obtained for the subsample analysis may not reflect the true estimates for the pandemic period. One way this could be rectified or resolved would be to use a high frequency data such that you restrict the time frame for just the pandemic years, that's 2020 to 2021. However, such high frequency data is not available for most sub-Saharan African countries. A future study also in relation to this paper would be to examine the key contribution of fiscal policy and monetary policy in the recovery phase of the economy following the pandemic. Thank you.